Investigated the attack on Americans in Saudi Arabia in November of 1995. We're going to go to, in just a second now, to ABC's Robert Krulwich and then talk to the engineer, or one of the engineers who worked on the trade tower, see if we can understand what it was that brought these buildings down today. But first, some more fairly late news from John Miller. John?
Since the rescue workers are now first starting to work that scene, they're starting to have some very interesting results. Two Port Authority police officers, the Port Authority being the entity that runs the World Trade Center, have been found trapped in the rubble. There is a team of police officers trying to dig them out. They're apparently alive. A strange case, a 911 operator in Pennsylvania says she's received a call from people trapped in the rubble 40 feet from the Vista Hotel or the Millennium Hotel. They say they're near a fountain.
On the west side of Manhattan.
Yes,
right.
In the World Trade Center complex. And they're calling out from where they're trapped beneath the rubble to a 911, perhaps on a Pennsylvania cell phone, but right. That went to an operator in Pennsylvania, and they're trying to kind of triangulate where they are to get to them. So things are picking up there. They've also brought in dogs from all the counties around the city to aid in helping to sniff victims out.
Exactly as we've said before today, exactly they do in the case of an earthquake. People are now underground, and dogs are just the best thing you have in trying to locate them.
Yet, as we've learned so often in modern times, in recent times, in Columbine, the role of the cell phone in modern disaster is incredible. From the people who called out from the airplane, something we really didn't expect, an odd development, to people perhaps calling out from the rubble, if that's a legitimate call to the Pennsylvania operator.
Great. John Miller, we'll come back to you. Now to try to examine the building, ABC's Robert Krulwich has put together a piece on the structural engineering of the World Trade Centers, perhaps better able help us to understand that when these two aircraft hit these two towers today, exactly what was going on. Robert?
Why did the towers collapse as quickly and as suddenly as they did? Engineers from the original firm that built the towers told ABC they can only guess at this point, but they believe that the collisions themselves, the plane hitting building number 1 and the plane that smashed into building number 2, by themselves, they did not cause the collapse. It was the fire, they say, the intense fire and heat from the explosions that brought the buildings down. Temperatures inside could have built up to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, steel loses its strength, and steel beams connect every floor to the outside walls. As it got hotter, the beams got weaker, and the hot air inside began to push and press against the outside walls until the outside walls just buckled, snapped, and released the top floor, which fell onto the floor below, and the entire building sinks in a straight vertical, the floors falling faster and faster down, until you notice that every floor in the building is gone. Viewed from another angle, you can see the same thing. Notice the aerial stays vertical, just stays straight as it sinks into the building. There's no buckling or tipping, just straight down. And this happened in both buildings. The first tower, too, stayed straight as it went down, each floor falling neatly on top of the other. So the reason the towers went so quickly is because all the floors were literally hanging onto the skin. And once the skin went, the buildings went too. Robert Krulwich, ABC News.
Well, that report, as we look at New York City at night, which has a still quality about it tonight. It's a city of light at night, as so many American cities are, but there's a still, almost calm look of it from the sky. It's anything but that on the ground. But this is the second time from Robert Krulwich and also from some architect engineers we talked to a little earlier that say it was the heat which caused the building to collapse, because the steel at the top of the building would maybe have only been able to sustain an hour and a half of intense fire, and then the steel begins, as Robert points out, so clearly collapse upon itself all the way down to the bottom. I think we have with us on the phone or in person from Seattle, John Magnuson, who is an engineer. John, are you there? John Magnuson, who is with the company that actually built the World Trade Center towers. John, have you heard our two layman explanations tonight of what it was we think collapsed the building, and do you agree or disagree?
I agree. I need to say one thing. At the time of the design of the World Trade Center, that was in the mid-1960s, and I was in 6th grade, so to kind of put in perspective how much time has passed since this design was actually completed. But the description of the fact that steel, when it gets up to 1,500, 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, that it loses its strength is accurate. The buildings actually survived the impact of both the planes, and it was really the fire that finally created the disaster.
And the upper floor fell on the next floor down, which fell on the next floor, and the sheer accumulation of weight just forced the whole building to collapse on itself.
Right there, from the videotape, and I can only go from what I've seen on television, but the videotape showed that several of the upper floors fell onto the next lower floor that was still intact. And once that happens, there's going to be an instant overload situation, and then it will fail. And then that will drop down to the next floor into another instant overload situation. And so the floors just progressively collapse down all the way to the bottom.
I appreciate very much the fact that you were very young in the mid-1960s when the trade towers were built, though I've heard it said earlier today that they in fact, were stronger, more sensible structures than many of the more daring shaped buildings that are being built in parts of the world today.
Right. The term that structural engineers use is redundancy. And the World Trade Center towers really set a new standard in redundancy. And that's why those airplanes were able to crash into the towers without causing the structural failure. The buildings were still standing. And then the problem was the fire and the jet fuel. And in normal buildings, all the steel is protected with fireproofing, and there's sprinkler systems, but they're not designed to protect against a jet fuel fire inside of a building.
Can you be a little more precise what you mean by redundancy?
Redundancy is that if you have a structural element that is damaged and is no longer able to carry the load, that load is able to be passed on to other elements or other columns or other beams within the building. And the columns on the World Trade Center, they were spaced at 39 inches on center all the way across each face.
What does that mean, 39 inches at center?
Every 3 feet 3 inches there was a column that supported the building. So they were very closely spaced together. Many buildings, the columns are 10 or 15 feet apart or more. And so having these very close spaced columns on the outside created a lot of redundancy. That's why there was able to be a hole in the side. If you go back and look at the tapes, there was a tremendous hole in the side of the building, and it didn't collapse until the fire brought it down.
And Trade Tower number 7, which was the last to go, which was a building 47 stories high, do you have any sense of why it ultimately collapsed? Was it the concussion of the other buildings collapsing which undermined it?
I'm not familiar with that building. We were not involved in that building, and I haven't seen any of the details on that yet.
So aside from your horror, which I assume you share with the rest of us today, when you look at what has happened today, do you learn something?
Well, it's a very difficult situation because if you take that much of a load and that much jet fuel and you put it into a building, there's very little that you can do. And really, I think the solution to this will be to keep the planes and keep these attacks away from the doorsteps of these buildings.
John Nance, who's our aviation analyst, said to us several hours ago when speculating, as we all are in many cases, about who may have been involved, said he would not be surprised if somewhere in the world there was a structural engineer who was part of this operation. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense. I sure would hope not. Every structural engineer is dedicated to preserving public safety. And just the thought that someone would take that training and use it for evil purposes just really disgusts me.
Is there anything I've missed, John? No? Okay. I'm very grateful for the time. What's it like up there in Seattle tonight? People feeling exactly the same thing people here in New York City are feeling?
Yes, and there was certainly a lot of apprehension during the day. Many of the buildings were evacuated just as precautionary measures. But there's this same empty feeling in your stomach about the whole thing, and just watching. People, of course, were glued to the coverage on the television sets.
Well, thank you for being so articulate about it and helping us understand, at least thank you very much, from the slightly cold-blooded language of engineers and journalists covering this from some distance today, the structure of the building, which may not have been able to stand up to that fire, which was caused when those two planes, the first and the second, struck under somebody's control, fairly high up in these superstructures, and then simply, as Robert Krulwich pointed out, and John Magnuson confirms, collapse down upon themselves. And it was the president, we think, George Stephanopoulos is still with me. You were down there all today. It was the president, we think, who gave some clue to that which we have feared most of the day, that it wasn't hundreds of people involved in this, but thousands.
But thousands, yes. But Peter, I think, and I was thinking of this as John Magnuson was talking, when you talk about the strength of the building, in the coming days, we're also going to be hearing about some amazing not only rescue stories, but survival stories. I spoke with the relative of someone who was on the 102nd floor of the first building today. After it took the hit from the airplane, that person still made it down from the 102nd floor and is home safe tonight.
It's very interesting because one of the lawyers had come down from a lower floor, believed that many people had got down in a fairly orderly fashion from some of the highest floors, at certainly right underneath where the attack had occurred, which has given people here, and I suspect in the country, some hope tonight that many more people got out of this building than we thought. It is now 9 o'clock Eastern Time. In the East, it is now 6 o'clock. On the West Coast, up and down the West Coast in the United States, it is about 12 hours, just 12 hours and a bit since many of us walking to work were suddenly confronted with having to deal with this in one way or another. And there's a huge, huge number of developments to catch up with. I want to go first of all, as we just review this, because this all happened in the morning of Good Morning, right in the middle of Good Morning, at the very end of Good Morning America. Charles Gibson, Charlie Gibson, and Diane Sawyer were there on television live when this happened, and so it seems appropriate that we go to Diane, and Diane, ask you to put together some reconstruction of it for us.
Traffic helicopters were the first to report an explosion in the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Witnesses say they saw it, a plane crashing into the building.
I saw something push the building in, and then I saw the tail, and then I saw flame.
Everybody else, let's go!
Evacuation begins inside the building. Then, a few minutes later, just after 9 a.m., as smoke pours from the top of the North Tower, an unbelievable sight, a second plane hitting the South Tower.
Oh my God! Oh, jeez! Oh my God!
There are gaping holes in flames coming now from both towers. Witnesses see people screaming from the higher floors.
They're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
I see people jumping from the top of the World Trade Center.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the fire.
It was about 10 o'clock a.m. when the South Tower collapsed.
A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
On the ground, there's chaos. Flaming debris, someone said, like the dark side of the moon.
It was bad. It was like a dust storm or something. Like I couldn't see anything.
About 20 minutes later, the second tower crumbles to the ground.
Oh my God, there it goes!
Symbols of New York, the World Trade Center towers, are simply gone.
Diane Sawyer giving us what it was like, at least from a distance, because we've all been at a distance from this, what it was like in those first moments. Now let's look at it from another perspective, because ABC's Lisa Stark, who covers aviation for us, as we've said several times today, is able, I think, to take you there, Lisa?
I am, Peter.
Lisa's in Seattle today, where she's been out at the Boeing company. It was Boeing jets, Boeing equipment, 757s and 767s involved. Why don't you just walk us through what you and we now know about how this unfolded from the point of view of the hijackers?
All right, I will, but Peter, I want to give you a little bit of new information first, if I may. There's a meeting going on, we understand, between the Federal Aviation Administration and the major carriers at this point. They are trying to determine how they might be able to get air service back up and going again tomorrow. what steps would need to be taken. We do understand from a number of sources that one of the things they are considering is a resumption of the Air Marshal program. That would be armed air marshals that would actually fly on a number of flights. Now, that happens now in the United States, but it's a very small percentage of flights. It's unclear whether they would ramp up to every flight. That seems unlikely. But whether they are considering whether they would put air marshals on a number of flights as a precaution throughout the United States, one of the options that they are talking about.
Okay, just before you go to your chronology then, let me remind people that what you mean by air service backup is because hundreds of airplanes and thousands of passengers, an extraordinary job of air traffic control and pilots getting planes safely on the ground when the FAA decided everybody should land at the nearest possible airport, many of which are in Canada. And so there are thousands of people stranded far away from home tonight, safe, but when you refer to air service being got back up again, you basically mean getting the nation's air communication systems back up and running.
Absolutely. There's a national ground stop throughout the United States until at least noon tomorrow. It's going to be a massive task to get the system up and running. And obviously, the main concern is to do it safely, to make sure that we don't have a repeat of the horrible events that we saw today. So there are security issues that are paramount, and there are also simply operational issues. How do you sort of turn the switch back on and get as many as 40,000 flights every day in the United States back in the air? And those discussions about that are underway right now, we understand.
We'll all follow that one. Now take us, if you would, through the movement of the aircraft which were ultimately and fatally involved.
What we know is that American Airlines Flight 11 was the first plane involved. That was the plane, a 767, en route from Boston's Logan Airport to Los Angeles. The plane took off shortly after 8 o'clock, we understand. About a half hour into the flight, it made a sharp left turn down towards New York. There were massive changes in airspeed apparently at that time. As the plane then headed toward Manhattan, it slowed and slammed into the World Trade Tower. It had been in the air about 45 minutes. Now, at the same time this was going on, there was a United Airlines 767, Flight 175, also from Boston to Los Angeles. It also was in the air, taken over by hijackers. That plane made a turn towards New Jersey, then made virtually a U-turn and came up toward the Trade Tower from the south, came over Staten Island. It slammed into the second Trade Tower. It had also been in the air about 45 minutes. Now, before any of these planes actually hit the World Trade Center, a third plane, a United Airlines 757, American Airlines American Airlines 757, it was Flight 77 from Dulles, had taken off. It was bound for Los Angeles as well. We don't know much about the flight path of that plane. We believe it was in the air about 1 hour before it hit the Pentagon. Then we have the fourth plane, United Flight 93, another 757 en route from Newark to San Francisco. We are unclear about the departure time. We have some conflicting information about that, whether it was close to 8 o'clock or closer to 8:45. It did depart Newark Airport. It appears that hijackers may have taken control of the plane over Cleveland. That is when it suddenly made a turn back toward the east. We also understand that sometime at that point, someone from the cockpit called the FAA and requested a change in flight plan. They said, we're not going to San Francisco. We want to go to Washington, D.C., to DCA, which is National Airport. It's unclear whether there was another Washington target, perhaps, that this plane was aiming for. Either way, it didn't make it all the way to Washington. It crashed in Pennsylvania. A total of 266 passengers and crew on all four of these planes. The toll could have been even much, much worse on the jetliners because they were very lightly filled. They can hold anywhere from 185 to 250 people. The most crowded plane had 90 passengers and crew members on it. Peter, we also want to mention, if we can, that as this was unfolding, people on board these planes were able to communicate what was going on. We know some details about that. We know on Flight 11, that was the American Airlines flight, the first one that hit the World Trade Tower, a flight attendant was able to call the American Airlines Operations Center. The flight attendant informed them that a number of flight attendants had been stabbed and that the perpetrators had stormed the cockpit. She was also able to tell them, apparently, the seat number of at least one of the hijackers. She was able to give them that information. We also know that there were some cell phone calls from at least 2 of the other planes. There was a cell phone call, as you have reported earlier, from the plane that slammed into the Pentagon, a woman calling her husband, saying that these hijackers were on board, that they had box cutters, those sorts of knives, and they had herded all of the passengers into the back of the plane. And we understand there was also a cell phone call on the United 175 flight. That was the other flight that hit the World Trade Tower. Apparently, a son on that plane called his father from his cell phone and also said there were hijackers on board with knives. So we do know that as the events were unfolding, what was going on 30,000 feet above the United States was being communicated. Of course, unfortunately, there was nothing the people on the ground could do about any of this except watch in horror as these planes ended up where they ended up.
Well, thanks very much, Lisa Stark, who has given a very clear picture many times today on what precisely happened, or at least as much as we know of what happened. Thank you. On board those planes, we do not very often make recommendations for people's behavior from this chair, but as Lisa was talking, I checked in with my children, and who are deeply distressed, as I think young people are across the United States. And so if you're a parent, you got a kid in some other part of the country, call them up, exchange observations. People have been getting onto sites on the web, which is a very good, vigorous way for people, very good way for people to communicate. Some of the things people have been telling us at ABC News, at abcnews.com, after today, nothing changes. Sorry, everything changes. Nothing will ever be the same. The way you've lived your life, enjoyed your freedom, your very personal expression, it all changes after today. From someone else, only a month ago, I laid on a bench outside the World Trade Center and marveled at what man could create, looking up at those 110 stories, and now I stare in disbelief at what man can take away. I want retribution, said one person to abcnews.com, and that's a sentiment that has been widely, deeply expressed in the heart of the political establishment in Washington and by people in every walk of life across the country. And as George Stephanopoulos and Leon Panetta, the former White House Chief of Staff, have made very clear, and the President clearly knows already, one of the things the President has to do is be patient and understand who it is who did this before the country can do anything by way of retaliation. Here's a slightly chilling one. If they can pull off an act like this, they are certainly capable of eventually sending nuclear weapons this way. And this is very interesting. How can people keep calling it the modern Pearl Harbor? At least we knew who we were up against back then. Of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese was a surprise to a great many Americans in the middle of afternoon ball games. This is the first time today that Major League Baseball has ever canceled all its games since D-Day, the invasion of Normandy in World War II. And one of the enormously frustrating things for the intelligence establishment, for the political establishment, for all of us in the country today, not to mention anyone else in the world who was a friend of the United States, perhaps even a foe, is to understand who it was who actually did this. And the reverberations from this are indeed global. Air traffic, we already know, listening to Lisa Stark and our own reporting earlier today, is snarled around the world, especially in Europe. The impact of what happens there in terms of transportation and commerce. The stock exchange was closed today. It all has an effect somewhere else. Any place there is a proposed mass gathering, in many parts of the world, they are rethinking it. In Germany, they have now canceled the Frankfurt car show, which is one of the biggest car shows, if not the biggest car show in the world. There's some consideration to canceling the Oktoberfest, the great beer and culture festival in Munich, in Germany. France has called a general security alert, and I'm just told that Ted Koppel is with us in London, live. Ted has been in London and now can go even further than that, please, Ted, on telling us what's happened in Europe and as much as you know elsewhere.
Well, I must tell you, Peter, I've spent the better part of this day trying to get from where I was, which about 12 hours ago was in Italy, to where you are. And as you well know, and as you've been reporting for much of the day, getting into the United States from overseas is a very difficult task indeed, but it's just about, what time is it here? 2:15 in the morning here in London. And some of the early editions of the newspapers have come through, and I thought you might like to take a look at them. Let me hold them up. There's not a great deal that differentiates the tabloids today from the more serious newspapers. You can see it, Apocalypse, New York, September 11th, says the Daily Mail. Declaration of war, says the Daily Express. And then this one, which perhaps goes farther than it might, is this the end of the world, from the Daily Star? And so it goes. The Mirror, war on the world. The Sun, the day that changed the world. And now one of the more serious newspapers, The Independent, and again, the same horrific pictures that we have been seeing all day long. And The Independent says, Doomsday America, the times of London when war came to America, and so it has gone. And I must tell you, Peter, the only thing I can tell you is, as you know, when we're overseas, American tourists tend to turn to folks like us, expecting that we know something. I'm afraid I knew less than they did. It was some other tourists who informed me earlier in the day of what had happened, and I went rushing back to my hotel room and packed while I was watching the television scenes that you have been reporting on all day. And all I can tell you is that this was a day when, as soon as people found out you were an American, they turned to you with expressions of grief, expressions of horror, expressions of outrage, and an offer to do anything they could do to help, which in my case meant getting a little bit closer to New York or Washington. Peter?
Ted, have you managed, I totally sympathize with what you've gone through today, and as bad as a day it is for many Americans, I understand what you mean when you say it's been a good day to be reminded that people around the world admire and sympathize with Americans, suffer with it. Can you give us some sense, if you have any whatsoever, just from looking at the reporting there, as to how governments are responding as well as individuals?
Well, again, Peter, and you've been in this situation often enough to be sympathetic to it. I literally just landed in London. We had to charter from Paris to get over here because flying into Heathrow wasn't that easy, especially at this time of night. And have only landed now and been reading the wires in the car coming in. And I do know that Tony Blair has expressed strong condemnation and, of course, a sense of oneness with the United States. Perhaps, Peter, the most interesting thing that I've heard, and just read a little bit of a transcript of a television newscast that came out of Tehran earlier this evening, is that the Iranian president, Khatami, is quoted by Iranian anchors earlier this evening as expressing his outrage and offering to help in any way that he can against this form of worldwide terrorism. Coming from Iran, that is quite remarkable, as I'm sure you know.
I do indeed, though perhaps a little more understandable coming from President Khatami, who is regarded as the president of Iran, who, as you well know, is trying to move the country closer to some kind of sense of democratic representation than others in the country are willing him to do. But I think we've all known for a long time that sometimes elements within the Iranian political establishment or on the edges of the political establishment operate in ways that other parts of the political establishment are not aware of. Anyway, I won't...
Right. But no, go ahead, Peter.
No, I was just going to say, I don't want to impose on you anymore, because I know you want to, I know, like anybody else arriving on scene, you want to sit down and get as much as you can. So please come back to us at any time that you want. You want to add something now?
Just one thing, and I realize compared to what everyone has been going through in the United States today, and especially the citizens of New York and Washington, this seems like a small thing, but I'm sure it was reflected today thousands, if not tens of thousands of times. Being overseas and picking up the phone, I've got 3 youngsters, as you know, who live in New York City. Just trying to get through on the phone today could be such a trial. And 2 of my youngsters, 3 of them actually, work down in downtown New York. And all I can tell you is you stop being a newsman real fast, and all you want to do is be a father and find out that the kids are all right and that everything is okay. And for so many, many people today, Americans around the world, still wondering at this late hour what's happened to their loved ones, all I can tell you is the grief and the sympathy of the world goes out to all.
You're absolutely right, Ted. And as a man, as I just said just before we joined you, just got off the phone with at least one of his kids and the others trying to call him. I totally appreciate it. We'll let you go to work. Please come back anytime, anytime that you feel like it with news from overseas. But as Ted indicates, when he holds up the tabloids, sometimes known as the popular newspapers and the more serious broadsheet newspapers in Britain, they all have those same headlines that this strike on America has somehow changed things. And it's not as if the United States, in the wake of Oklahoma City, was not aware that it could happen on the American mainland, but they use phrases like apocalypse now in the movie sense, among other things, and just make you realize how deeply this has felt and what impact it's had in other parts of the world. It's interesting that several, well, it's interesting in a very minor way, that several people today have noted the oddity of the date, 9th day of the 11th month, as the 3 digits of the emergency number 911. George, I'll be with you in a minute, George Stephanopoulos. We've kept John McCarthy at the Pentagon, who's been frustrated, John, I think a little because they've forced you to stay. Have they forced you to stay where you are and will not let you get into your normal listening post inside the Pentagon?
That's right. The security around the Pentagon is extreme. We have been allowed to get cameras a little closer on a very restricted basis, Peter. That was where we were able to take pictures of some of the bodies lined up outside the Pentagon, some of the grim evidence. You were talking about people worrying about their loved ones. Well, calls are going out from the Defense Department tonight of those bodies that have been identified. There are still many, many missing in the rubble of the Pentagon, so that search goes on tonight. You may notice behind me there are still fires burning on the roof of the Pentagon. They have been struggling all day to put out these fires, and they have moved along the rim of the Defense Department, and they break through. The firemen go up on the roof in very heroic efforts. They break through the roof. It breathes air, and that gives the fire new life, and then they pour water down those infernos as they burn. So the fight is still continuing here at the Pentagon to try and bring the fires under control so they can go after those people who are still trapped in the rubble. John,
we're looking at a second graphic. We had one earlier today which appeared to show that the depth or the width of the tragedy, not to mention the depth into that inner courtyard. And you described the great gash across the building as being, I think, about 200 feet wide. Is my sense tonight that fire has spread to places where you didn't anticipate it was going to spread earlier in the day?
There are fires that have spread along air ducts and along the very top attic section of the Pentagon, well beyond where the actual gash was. But Peter, the destruction, as the plane hit the Pentagon at an oblique angle, it dumped some of the fuel, apparently, in an explosive blast in one direction, and the damage is far, far worse on one side of the gash on the Pentagon than it is on the other.
And it looks to be the side on the right to our eye here. Am I right about that? Looked at from your perspective?
Correct. That's
okay.
Correct.
John McCarthy, thank you very much indeed again. We're going to stay in the Washington area now because Claire Shipman, the House Intelligence Committee has just had a briefing, and I believe that Claire, you've managed to get a briefing from someone in the Intelligence Committee to tell us what went on.
News.
Hang on a sec, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can, now go ahead.
All right, sorry, trouble with my sound tonight. What we were told from Democratic and Republican leadership sources on Capitol Hill is that they had a briefing, an intelligence briefing, a little bit earlier today from members of the intelligence community, including the CIA, and that they were told, quote, the CIA had some hard facts, and of course this won't surprise you, that were pointing to Osama bin Laden. In fact, the source told me they were surprised how blunt the CIA was with them at this point. We've also been told, it's interesting, Peter, even in the midst of all of this tragedy today, that there was a little bit of grumbling in Washington. Some members of Congress frustrated that they weren't hearing from the president, that the president wasn't back in Washington. But the leadership says that they absolutely understand why the president was traveling around the country today, and that they have the scene we saw on Capitol Hill earlier of bipartisanship was not an act, that it's very genuine. The leadership was briefed 4 times by Vice President Cheney earlier today. They didn't hear from Bush directly, but they were very happy with what they heard from him tonight. They're planning to convene tomorrow to pass a piece of legislation condemning all of the terror, and then it's not clear whether or not they're going to stay in session. They're trying to decide how much sense that makes and how appropriate it is.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. We'll come back. We'll come back to you as the evening wears on. I know there are people in the country who will express this sentiment, so I express it as much on behalf of other people. We believe at this point we knew absolutely nothing in advance, and we've said that several, if not several dozen times today, and here we are within minutes, I shouldn't take that back, within hours of an incident involving terrorists about which we've heard not much throughout the day, and already we have someone in the Intelligence Committee, or maybe it's through a member of Congress, pointing the finger at Osama bin Laden. I'll turn to George Stephanopoulos to talk about this a little bit, and then perhaps to talk to our defense analyst in Washington in just a moment. Tony, the skeptics just say, oh, they point the finger at Osama bin Laden.
Because it's easy, and we need a face.
Exactly.
We need a face.
We need someone to
demonize. And someone to blame, and someone to demonize, and someone to attack. And I think there'll probably be some grumbling from the Central Intelligence Agency and others in the intelligence community that information like this was frankly leaked out of the House Intelligence Committee or out of the Congress, because that's one of their big complaints consistently with the Congress. Is one of the reasons we can't trust the Intelligence Committee with this information is because the minute we talk about it, it gets out in the public domain. But I do think it does speak to something that we'll see happening in the coming days.
Before you go on to the coming days, I apologize. Don't want to hold you up except this. Do you think, from your experiences in government, that there is a tendency to blame Osama bin Laden, even when there is not necessarily any basis on which to precisely point the finger at him? I don't mean that Osama bin Laden gave money to someone in the country, but within hours of this, we're beginning to point at the same man we point to in almost every instance.
I would say a tendency to find a specific target that you can blame as quickly as possible, not necessarily Osama bin Laden. But I remember very well in early 1993, after former President Bush, there was an assassination attempt against him. Right. The FBI and the CIA spent several weeks trying to find out who was responsible. They finally did identify people, but there was an awful lot of pressure from the people on the ground, especially to say, yes, 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 we have it. And you felt that a lot of people further back in Washington were saying, are you sure?
Yeah, I think the public is pretty actually wise about this now, because we've been through so many experiences where we thought it was Iran, and maybe it turned out to be Libya. We thought it turned out to be Libya, and then the suspect was Syria, and it turned out to be Palestine. Thought it was Palestinians, and it turned out to be an American.
And one other thing, not to discount, Peter, I'm not suggesting this is happening in this case, but you always have to be careful. Those who are doing the briefings may have an agenda of their own within the government, trying to build pressure for an action they want.
Now, you were going to, before you go on to your other point, Claire Shipman mentioned that they were going to pass legislation tomorrow, which will be national legislation respectful of the day.
And support for the president.
And support for the president, and support for the various government agencies. There's very quickly going to be a demand and request for doing something more than already, and money.
For much more. And whenever you have these kinds of terrorist acts, whether it was Oklahoma City or the assassination attempt on President Bush or the Khobar Towers Congress acts, remember, after TWA Flight 800, we first got those questions that were asked of every air passenger. Have your bags been with you at all times? And has anyone else, have they ever been out of your sight? That was never asked before. You'll see something far more stringent, I would guess, coming onto Congress now. Far more attempts after the Oklahoma City bombing. There were attempts to increase the FBI's wiretapping capabilities and tracing gunpowder and other kinds of ammunition. And also after Al-Khobar, more money for intelligence. You'll see that coming out of the Congress.
But you make a very good point, and we discussed it a little earlier today. I've forgotten, I think it was James Woolsey we began talking to, and pointing out that how important it is for Americans at the moment to appreciate freedoms in the country. And I think it was somebody very early in the day who quoted Edmund Burke when he talked about ordered liberty, because there will be pressure in some communities in pursuit of international terrorism to make it tougher for Americans to enjoy all of their freedoms. Do you believe that?
No question about it. After Oklahoma City, there was even an attempt to start to catalog these domestic militias in a way that we would have never done before that, and that was something, there was an outcry at the time, but I would suspect that after something like this, people will say, we're willing to sacrifice some liberties in order to get the security.
Okay, thanks, George. Please don't go away. We want to go back downtown to hear one more time from Diane Sawyer, and I say one more time because if you think about it, she has been up longer and working longer on this story than any of us. It was late in Good Morning America when this happened, and Diane, I know you need in some way, at least I think you do, prepare for tomorrow. So why don't you just take some time now and tell us about the day from your perspective.
I will, Peter, and we will be back on in the morning very early. And of course, I know you're going to be going along through the night too, so we'll probably pass the torch sometime in the middle of the night. I want to tell you what we just did. We decided to make our way as close as we could get to Ground Zero, and I can now report to you that I've seen what's going on inside if you go all the way up and inside. At the scene itself, where the Twin Towers were, one tower completely level. I saw no signs of fire there now. It is a truly eerie scene because, of course, there's no light, there's no electricity, and you see silhouetted firemen, silhouetted EMS workers, everyone moving around, and in unbelievable conditions because the soot is up to your ankles, you're tripping over piping. There are those horrible grotesque sculptures of the burned out cars and the burned out buses all around you every place. The other building, the other tower building, there seems to be the base of it still standing. They're still spraying it with water all the time, although they told me they're going to really wait for daylight to do much more. Then we went over to building 7, which also burned and burned later in the afternoon. And over there, you're hearing the crumbling sounds. It almost sounds as if you're going to have a rock fall or a landslide or an avalanche because the building is creaking and moaning as it continues to crumple. Now, there was still fire. I couldn't determine exactly where it was. I didn't know if it's that Marriott hotel or not. We saw flames still going up in the air, but it was impossible to determine from where we were exactly what that fire is right now. And Don Daler fanned out in a different direction. I'm going to bring him in once again to see what you saw, Don.
Well, I just a moment ago saw a doctor in full medical scrubs walking from the direction of the scene, and I asked him, was there anybody that he even got to work on down there? And he said no, that they didn't have any victims or injured people who were coming out to the triage area. So either the people who were injured have been brought out and are already at the hospitals, or there's nobody coming out right now. And that just now happened.
You think you saw a K-9 unit deploying as well?
We saw a K-9 unit, and we heard reports that there were some Metro workers trapped somewhere down in that area, and also there was a 911 cell phone call, a report of a 911 cell phone call from a Philadelphia area code that was traced to the region, to the area down near the Marriott Hotel. But we are, in the next couple days and hours, certainly we're going to hear probably as many tragic stories as you saw leaves of paper, but one of them was a fireman who just came by moments ago, did not want to go on camera. He was down there very early in the day and had actually witnessed one of his fellow firemen killed by a falling body, by someone who had jumped from the building.
Unending tragedy. The firefighters working down there now, the grit in your eyes makes it almost impossible to see. The soot is absolutely everywhere still. And we talked to you before, Peter, about the fact that all of these documents, I cannot tell you what it is like to see this sea of financial documents every place. And I just picked up randomly a couple of them, and they're analysis of someone's budget, and then there's an analysis of an insurance filing, and you just keep thinking how important all of these seemed to someone 24 hours ago.
Well, Diane, thank you very much indeed for your work today. It goes without saying we value enormously. As you were talking, I was also trying to catch up to the ripple effect of this thing. We know that aircraft are grounded. Lisa Stark told us a short while ago that aviation authorities and various other governmental authorities are discussing whether or not this freeze on air travel in the country is going to last as long as the original 12-hour delay they put in it, because among other things, Postal Service officials are now saying that mail is only going to be delivered within 600 miles of its point of origin for at least the next 24 hours, because mail going beyond 600 miles goes by a commercial carrier, and that's surely one of the things the government is talking about at the moment in terms of the interruption of national and, one could argue, international life at the moment. ABC's Betsy Stark, who covers the stock market, national business affairs, and international business affairs, is with us at the moment. Betsy, put together for us, if you will, the picture of a world, or much of the world, that has been brought to a halt in many ways by these incidents today.
Well, Peter, we're certainly reminded that we have a global economy and global markets. European and Latin American markets had a chance to respond to events today. As you know, U.S. financial markets were closed all day, but markets in Europe and Latin America were down sharply. Trading was halted in some of them. Asia is now having its first opportunity to react to these events, and in Japan, the Nikkei is down around 6.5%. It's been open for about an hour and a half now. Incidentally, that's the lowest level in 15 years. You know, the U.S. has been the world's real economic engine, and the U.S. is, as you know, the economy has been faltering, but this additional blow to those very visible symbols of the United States as the center of world finance has shaken investor confidence, and we're seeing that play out in global stock markets.
Now, all financial markets are going to be closed again tomorrow. The New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange will be closed tomorrow.
That's right, Peter. Incidentally, you were talking before about parallels to World War II. Interestingly, U.S. financial markets will be closed now for 48 hours. It's the first time since World War II that that's happened. And keep in mind that the New York Stock Exchange is just a few blocks from the World Trade Center Twin Towers. So in a sense, it's not surprising. It's going to be a while before rescue operations and cleanup operations make it possible for New York Stock Exchange employees to return to work. Having said that, Treasury Secretary O'Neill, who's in Japan today, no word yet on when he will return, certainly trying to reassure everybody, saying the U.S. economy is strong and resilient. We had the Fed issuing messages today saying it will do what must be done to make sure that money continues to flow through the U.S. economy and to make sure the banking system continues to run smoothly, which it did by and large today.
In fact, the global economy and the greater number of stock exchanges in many more places makes 24-hour trading with or without the, well, to some degree, with or without the New York and American Stock Exchanges today more possible, does it not?
Yes, it does, Peter. You know, one other thing I wanted to mention to you is there were economists talking today about the possibility that this might be the straw that breaks the camel's back, that this might be the event that tips the U.S. economy into recession. I mean, think about it. When markets don't trade, when planes don't fly, when businesses shut down, as we saw so many do today, when malls close, that's a drag on the U.S. economy. People aren't out there spending, and when you've got an economy that's growing at a snail's pace, those kinds of, that kind of slowdown in the economy just for a period of days has the potential to push an economy teetering on recession over the brink.
Thanks very much, Betsy Stark, who will continue to report the economic dimensions of this. You know that so many, largely depending on where you live, I guess, that many of the government and both federal and state offices around the country are closed today. Ironically, the Texas governor granted a 30-day stay to an inmate who faced execution tonight after the worst terror attack in American history, at least on American soil. In Georgia and in many other states around the country, the legislatures ceased doing business if they were in session at the time. And reflecting what we saw on Capitol Hill, maybe we could get that piece of tape up again for people who didn't see it. It was a very moving national moment when members of the House and the Senate stood together and sang spontaneously or not, God Bless America. The Emmy Awards, television's highest awards, which were scheduled for Sunday, next Sunday, have been postponed immediately, and so have another series of awards. There's a whole list of everything that has been postponed or delayed. And when Betsy Stark talks about the Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, who's been saying to the country and the world for the last couple of days, as has the president, that he expects the economy to come back by the end of the year, it is part of an important psychological process as well as a business one to say to the rest of the world, as Senator Tom Daschle did when he talked about Congress will be open for business tomorrow. And that has been reasserted as a government theme at both the state and the federal level throughout the day. And so this scene on the steps of the Capitol building tonight, just as the sun was going down, was very, very moving.
From the mountains to the prairies to the ocean, white with foam, God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
We're sometimes pretty cynical or skeptical about politicians, but there is an example of politicians doing what politicians are supposed to do, which is to give the constituents, all of us across the country, some sense of leadership. We're joined now by Pierre Thomas, who covers the FBI and the Justice Department for us. And Pierre, it's early days, but I gather they've got the tiniest direction to go, at least in one of the investigations.
Yes, Peter, we're being told by sources that the FBI has begun to execute a number of search warrants, including in the state of Florida. My source will not give me additional information at this particular time. He emphasizes that it is at the very earliest stages of the investigation. This may turn out to be nothing, but the search warrants being executed are based on the passenger manifest. They have taken some of the names off of the manifest, and they're going to search some of the homes to find if additional clues.
So these are people we believe, or at least we believe the FBI believes, are living in the United States?
Absolutely. These are some of the names that came up on the passenger manifest. They are going to their homes, conducting searches, looking for paper, any kind of information that might lead to answers to why this happened.
We do believe, Pierre, I think from earlier, that one of the stewardesses, one of the flight attendants, my apologies to stewardess, flight attendants, a flight attendant on the American Airlines flight was able to communicate to her base or to somebody else which seat one of the terrorists was sitting in. Does this contribute to the investigation now?
It does, Peter, and a number of sources told me tonight that a number of passengers and flight attendants were able to dial 911 and also reach some of their relatives. And they describe a pretty horrific scene, scenes of people being attacked, in some cases being stabbed. And one source said he could only imagine the horror of what was going on some of those planes.
Okay, Pierre, thanks very much. Pierre Thomas, who covers the FBI and the Justice Department, who says it's moving, at least in terms of the investigation. And we've known since the last 12 hours of this massive coming together of intelligence operation. And John McCarthy, let me ask you about the National Security Agency, which has the technical... You there, John? Jack?
I'm here.
I can't see you nor hear you.
Well,
okay.
I'm here.
Okay, thanks very much. Not you, it's our inability to see you. The National Security Administration, the National Security Agency, rather, which tapes so much stuff. Just tell us what basically they do that's fairly common knowledge, and what will they be doing tonight?
They have the ability to sweep up. Imagine a huge vacuum cleaner. All of the communications that are going around the world, they sweep them up in a very sort of broad way, and then they look for certain phone numbers and certain things that are of interest to investigators and try and single out some of those conversations. So what they are doing is they have millions and millions of phone calls that they have sucked up into this vacuum cleaner. They have to be very careful because if it is an American citizen, there are very strict rules of the road for how you go about dealing with those kinds of communications. But they will be sorting through all of the communications that have been going from phone numbers that they have a very specific interest in, looking for clues.
Okay, thanks very much, Jack. Thank you very much. Just turn around now because Governor Pataki is here. Hi, Governor, how are you? Thank you for coming. Have you got a microphone on? And if you couldn't, would you mind going and sitting down and take George Stephanopoulos' microphone? Governor Pataki, the governor of New York, we've seen him a couple of times today, briefing in the first instance by himself and then with the mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani. And I am grateful, sir, as I'm sure the audience is, that you take time from pressing events at the least to come in and tell us what's going on.
Well, Peter, we're doing everything we can.
You know John Miller, by the way.
Yes, of course I know John. We're doing everything we can to try to make sure that we rescue as many people as possible, provide the services to those who have been injured, make sure we have the medical support staff and the emergency teams in place, and I
apologize, I'm going to interrupt you several times.
Sure.
Are you rescuing people at the moment? Because we're not certain.
We have the equipment down in Lower Manhattan right now. The city has its police and fire emergency services down there, and we've augmented it with our National Guard heavy equipment that is down there right now. I cannot say that anybody has been rescued, that anybody has been uncovered, but because the first step is to put out the fires and to make sure that the rescue workers are safe, but that's the goal.
There's some reports of people using their cell phones. In fact, John remarked on this earlier, people using their cell phones from under the rubble to communicate their location. Have you been able to get to people in those situations?
I can't say that anybody's been able we've been able to get to anybody, but I do know that every step that can be taken is being taken.
Okay, so go on with what have you been doing this afternoon and this evening?
Well, I wanted to make sure that we had the support team, and we've been working with Mayor Giuliani to augment the city's services. I also spoke with the president and the vice president, and we were getting security briefings on a regular basis. And Peter, I got to tell you that the outpouring of support from around the surrounding area, from around the country and around the world has been enormous. You know, this is a very dark day in American history, but we're going to get through it. The people's resolve is strong, the spirit is strong, and we will not allow our freedom to be taken from us.
I know you said yourself you've talked to President Bush and to Vice President Cheney. We had the impression that for a while there today, Mr. Cheney was the only person left in the White House.
No, I spoke with the president early, probably 9:20, 9:30 this morning, and he's been extremely responsive. All the help we've needed from the federal government we've gotten.
Do you need anything more? The Attorney General said that they were sending in some different kinds of emergency teams to New York. Does that mean you are in real need at the moment?
Right now, all the needs that we've been told about have been met. But as we go forward, this is not going to be a one-night or a one-day effort. This is going to go on for days and weeks. And the emergency forces that are there are going to need relief. We're going to have to rotate teams in and out. We're going to need specialized teams. And that's why we're very grateful that we have had this support from the federal government, from the surrounding governors, and from everybody pulling together.
John?
We're hearing the first reports of people being rescued at the scene, but you know, there's a couple of ironies here. Your office, the governor's office, used to be in the World Trade Center.
That's right.
At another time not long ago, you would have been there today.
That's right. And we still have a lot of state offices there, and I have a number of friends who were there this morning.
A number of friends who are unaccounted for even now?
Unaccounted for right now.
Which means that, in all likelihood, you probably know people who were killed in this.
We don't want to give up hope at this point. As I said, we're continuing to do everything we can to try to continue the search and rescue operations, and until everything's been done, hope is something you have to have.
Governor, how close have you come to seeing for yourself what it's like?
I've been to the hospitals. I was with, and the spirit is incredible. I was at St. Vincent's with some injured police and firefighters who were in the hospital injured, and they wanted to go back. They wanted to go back down to help their colleagues. And I was at Cabrini when we had lines of people blocks long on the street looking to donate blood. So the spirit of the people, the response has been not one of allowing the terrorists to frighten New Yorkers off the streets. It's been one of pulling together, showing that spirit, showing that hope. And you know, we've seen death and we've seen destruction, but we've also seen hope. And we will get through this.
You travel through the city in pretty organized fashion at the moment. There are a lot of people out in the city tonight?
No, and they shouldn't be. The vast majority of the people are home, and that's where we want them. But we need to have the highways and the streets clear for the emergency services and the emergency vehicles, and they are right now.
Are all of the hospitals in the city able to cope with what's been presented to them? I recall that earlier today you were calling for doctors to volunteer, and you were calling for nurses to volunteer.
We have seen an outpouring of volunteers in the hospitals, and we've seen an outpouring of donations of blood, so that at this point, the hospitals have the supplies, have the staff, have the support to be able to deal with the crisis as it moves forward. But what's going to happen, Peter, is those doctors, those nurses are going to get tired, and we're going to need the relief teams. And we've set up a statewide system to make sure that people don't just come here, but they register, so that as we need them, we can call on them and bring them in waves to help with that process.
You and Mayor Giuliani have both gone out of your way today to say to people that they must be patient, that in time the United States will retaliate, and that's a matter for the federal government. You want to just give us your thoughts on that?
Peter, that's right. This is something where I'm confident that the president and his team and our military have the ability to retaliate and take the appropriate action, and I'm confident they will. You know, we've seen anger on the streets, and there are moments when I feel it myself, but I've also seen hope, and we have to let that anger not overcome our desire to make sure we are still a nation of laws and a nation of justice. So let the federal government deal with the terrorists, let them make the appropriate response, and let's turn our anger to constructive efforts to rebuild and to pull us together.
It's interesting, Governor. I'm not even sure you know this, but we just heard a short while ago that Kmart, is 2,100 stores in the country, are not going to sell guns and ammunition at the moment. They've taken all their guns and their ammunition off the shelves, which suggests that someone else besides yourself understands there's real anger in the community, and these are those unfortunate times when prejudice sometimes tends to boil over.
There is anger, there is prejudice, but we have to put that aside and understand that the terrorist acts that have devastated the city and frightened the country are aimed at taking away our freedom, and we cannot take away other people's freedom in retaliation. We have to be a nation of laws. Let the president, let the administration make the appropriate response, and let's turn that anger to hope, turn it to action, turn it to working to make sure that we come back as a city and as a country as strongly as possible.
You have no doubt about it, I gather.
I have no doubt about it. This city has been through an enormous tragedy today. This is one of the darkest days in American history, and it's an ongoing nightmare, but we will get through this. Our freedoms will be intact, and this city and this country will be stronger than ever.
Governor Pataki, Governor George Pataki, Governor of New York, thank you very much for coming in. Opportunity to talk to you in person. We've seen you several times today on the television. I know exactly how busy you are. Thank you, sir. Let's go back to the streets of New York and ABC's Bill Blakemore, who is downtown. All of this, of course, is at the lower part of Manhattan on the western side of the city on the Hudson River, and ABC's Bill Blakemore is there. And John, you've heard the governor say that things are pretty quiet on the street. Is that the way you find it down there? Hang on, Bill. Hang on. Can't hear you just yet. Hang on. My apologies. Give us one of those 1, 2, 3s, if you wouldn't mind.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you very much. Now I hear you. Go ahead.
Can you hear me, Peter, now?
I can, Bill. Go ahead.
It's very eerie down here in the financial district, Peter. We're just slightly north of the wreckage. The electricity is out everywhere, so we're only able to see things by the very harsh floodlights that have been brought in a few places. There's still smoke billowing out of the wreckage and out of 1 or 2 buildings right next to it. We understand the Marriott Hotel is still on fire. They're pouring water on where they can. But within the past hour, firefighters have told members of our ABC News team that it's clearly going to be morning before they can begin to move any of these hundreds of volunteers, firemen, other rescue workers in to begin to try to make something of it. People who have been right down next to the base of what was the trade towers say there's virtually nothing left, maybe a few flights of stairs, a few stories of one of the buildings, but that when they came down there was so much melting and so much demolishing of any kind of structure that they cannot imagine much being left or much hope of finding anybody alive, though search and rescue is being mounted. We've seen dog teams being brought into position. There are hundreds of firemen just to the west of me here over on the West Side Highway, and dozens of fire trucks and police cars ready to move in. But for the moment, mostly it's just trying to get the temperature down at the base of where the trade towers were and to get the rest of the fire stopped.
And Bill, one knows from past experience that a huge amount of heavy equipment is needed in the area in order to continue the searching operation. Do you see it showing up?
Indeed, we've seen every now and then fleets of bulldozers and other heavy equipment moving through the back streets here. In the dark as it is just now, every now and then a fleet of flashing lights and sirens will go by as the people working on the strategy here are trying to figure out how to get these pieces of equipment into position for what they're going to have to do in the morning. But we can see that it's clearly going to be many days of a great deal of grim work to try to take it apart and to do what they can for anybody that they can find alive. But it's going to be morning before we can really see it.
Thanks very much, Bill Blakemore. One of the things that people who aren't familiar with this part of New York may not fully appreciate is that the trade towers stood, emphasis on stood, very close to the Hudson River. And the West Side Highway, which comes down the west side of New York, past the World Trade Center, and then tucks around and goes up towards, that's Brooklyn, in the map over to the right and across the Brooklyn Bridge and towards the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. The World Trade Center are very close to the edge of the river, and all that stuff right underneath the World Trade Center at the moment is basically landfill. And so there is a very narrow physical window through which the relief operators can work. Here's the mayor.
Than we need at this point. We're very grateful for it, and it'll be stored in areas, and probably over the next 2 or 3 days we will need it. And we'll do everything we can to support the efforts of the people who are trying to recover people from the debris and the horror that's taken place down there. The number to call if you have questions, I'm not sure we can answer all of your questions, but at least we can try to answer it, is 1-212-560-2730. That's 1-212-560-2730. If you have questions throughout the night and tomorrow, that's the number to call rather than 911, which you should just call if there is an emergency. We had over 1,100 emergency room visits today that we know of. So far, we have 6 fatalities that we know of, 5 at St. Vincent's. Obviously and tragically, there are going to be a lot more than that, but that's what we know of at this point. We had over 300 patients that were treated at St. Vincent's, over 160 at Bellevue, 250 at Beekman Downtown Hospital. And the hospital, these hospitals were probably the ones under the most stress, but they were able to get through. I want to thank all the people that helped St. Vincent's getting the water that they needed and the support that they needed. Also, I'd like to say to people that might consider doing this that services should be made available in New York City tomorrow on a fair and equitable basis. Anybody that thinks that they're going to gouge consumers or ask for extra amounts of money for food or anything else, we're going to have the police and the Consumer Affairs Department out there. So just be careful. This is a time in which we all have to cooperate and help each other. Alternate side street parking is suspended. Sanitation services will take place in most of the city, except obviously in the lower part of Manhattan, where the sanitation department will be working to remove debris, which has already started. And the schools, again, will be closed tomorrow. And hopefully we'll get them open as soon as possible. Tomorrow, the effort will be at trying to recover as many people as possible and trying to clean up the horrible mess that was created by all of this. And I would ask people to cooperate as much as possible in that effort. If you have to come into Manhattan because your business is essential, then obviously do it. The upper part of Manhattan will be open. But if tomorrow is a day in which you want to stay home and stay with your family and give comfort and support maybe to other people that have been affected by this, it would be a good day to do that. Yeah, the point that Richie Shearer makes is people are wonderful, and I mean this in the best sense of the word. We've had thousands and thousands of people that have come to help us. When I was down at the site near the World Trade Center, I met a lot of the National Guard's people that the governor has sent, really wonderful young men and women. We have enough volunteers now. We have more volunteers, frankly, than we need at this point. And what we need to do is to focus the efforts of the professionals that are there in being able to do the recovery and try to save as many lives as we can and restore services as quickly as possible. We may be asking for more volunteers tomorrow and the next day and the day after, but right now we don't need any more volunteers.
Mr. Mayor, is there still hope that there are people who are still alive and well?
Yes, there's hope. There's hope that there are people that are still alive.
How is the rescue effort hampered by the darkness? What do you do?
We moved a lot of lights in so that the area is being lit now, so that I don't think the rescue effort is going to be hampered by the darkness. The rescue effort is hampered by the fact that there's still fire there. There are still unsound structures, and it's still dangerous, although the rescue effort is now taking place. But if you're asking me, is it hampered? It's hampered because of the conditions, not because of the nighttime.
Is there a long procession of heavy bulldozers and other heavy construction equipment making its way down to lower Manhattan? What is that going to be used for?
That's going to be used to move debris out of the way so that the emergency vehicles can get in and out quickly, so that we can get the ambulances in a more expeditious fashion than we've been able to do. And I want to thank the Deputy Mayor Rudy Washington, who has spent most of the day coordinating, getting all of that emergency equipment in the right place, ready to move. If you go along Houston Street, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of pieces of equipment that are lined up to move in and to take debris out. And now they've started doing that. And I think that's probably what you observed. You probably observed.
The Mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, getting close to the end of his time in office, not able to succeed himself.
My concern from the point of view of
here in New York City, saying there is hope. He said darkness has made things more complicated, but we've heard from several sources that one of the first things they indeed moved into the site, and you can see it both at the Pentagon and here in New York City. You can see a large amount of temporary lights brought in some cases by the New Jersey Air National Guard. The mayor's saying it probably doesn't come as any great surprise to people. They've had tremendous number of volunteers. They've had tremendous volunteers for blood supplies, not only in New York, but around the country, of people wishing to contribute. And in true American volunteer spirit, they've got too many volunteers at the moment, and he says the time has now come to try to focus the effort. But this, and to our surprise, a little bit, he has given a number, which we'll repeat, given that he issued it, because I assume he knew he was talking on national television and not merely to the press. You think I'm right on that, John? Yeah. But there is a New York City number which you can call, 212, area code here, 560-2730. And given the involvement and engagement of the country as a whole at the moment, I don't know how that line is ever going to handle what the mayor or you would like it to handle, but there is another line which is handled today, and I think it's probably worth repeating. In fact, it's more than worth repeating. Something called the Victims of Crime Hotline, which the Attorney General mentioned to us an hour or so ago. This is for people who are pretty certain they have family members either involved in these aircraft or on the ground, and they can call this number 1-800-331-0075 and leave a contact number. You're not going to get any information as best we understand it. Now just leave a contact number which will tell somebody in government, which is ultimately running all this, that you are in need of information about a known crime. And let's jump to the bottom number there for a second, to report information known about the crimes. This is the FBI saying, as it does in every major crisis or incident like this, anybody knows anything? You can reach us on the web, www.ifccfbi.gov. Now the FEMA helpline, that's the Federal Emergency Management Administration, and we're not quite sure why their number is up there unless people believe they can offer help to FEMA, which is the emergency arm or wing or department of the federal government, which swings into action at any national emergency like this and organizes, particularly true in floods and fires and earthquakes, where it's a sort of superimposed agency that can help organize people on the ground, particularly true in smaller communities. Seen a lot of it in communities in the Midwest during the flooding of the Mississippi River and others. But here in New York, the message seems to be that New York, with what it has already required, seems to be able to cope, at least logistically, with what it has on its hands at the moment. And there is that phrase from the mayor, there is hope. To amplify just a little on a story we began to tell you earlier, there's a story out of Philadelphia just a short while ago, which say that a woman from Munhall, Pennsylvania, who was in New York, called 911 in Pennsylvania shortly after 8 p.m. to say that her brother was still trapped under 40 feet of rubble near the Forward Hotel in Manhattan. John, help me. The Forward Hotel is the Marriott Hotel, which used to be the Vista Hotel. It's all the same hotel, right?
It's now the Millennium Hotel,
okay.
But it's the hotel that stands directly in front of the World Trade Center on West Street.
All right. And she called to say that he gave specific directions to her where he was located and said he was there with 2 New York City policemen, because policemen and firemen are under this rubble as well, because they were going one way when everybody else was fleeing in the other way. We don't know who her name is and his name is, and it doesn't matter. But it is why, on an occasion like this, there's always hope. And if you think about a building collapsing on itself, we've seen this before in earthquakes, and we are always astounded, no matter where it is in the world, now how primitive the conditions, that people survive for days and days and days on end. So the imperativeness of getting, this place quiet, which would be very hard in the next few hours so that people can work in there with some measure of efficiency. The importance of getting in the dogs. They're sometimes called mortuary teams, which is grisly, but they're called that anyway. The federal government has sent 3 of them to New York and a couple to the Pentagon as well. But the value of dogs and the value of searching as quickly as you can through the rubble almost invariably turns up success stories, no matter where incidents like these occur. We've been joined by Barbara Walters, who I think is as appalled as all of us by this. What have you been doing? And what do you bring us?
Of course, we are all appalled. There aren't adjectives enough to describe how we feel.
Sure.
I just talked a few moments ago to Senator Orrin Hatch, who had some information. He said, remember the Millennium Threat, which of course you remember, Peter, we all do, and he said it was a very real threat, but if they had the intelligence to be able to block terrorist attacks. He said a month ago there was a general report that a big attack was being planned and that they pulled a ship out of the Persian Gulf. And he said they now have some data that says that people on the aircraft, these are his words, appeared to be associated with bin Laden. And furthermore, he has information that people generally associated with bin Laden, because he says it's more than one organization, acknowledge with joy that a couple of the other targets were hit. He said, Peter, that the next 12 to 24 hours are absolutely crucial, because if you don't find out who did this, within 24 hours, they all go underground. And he considers this an act of war.
Well, just before you go on, because I know you have some other news as well, if Senator Hatch is anywhere near a television set and can hear us, we'd like him to come on and explain this in some detail, because I think there's some skepticism around this. These remarks by Senator Hatch have been around by some time, and now they've been repeated by him to you, that there's somehow an Osama bin Laden collection very quickly. And I know people are desperate to find out what, but we certainly would like the Senator to come on and explain in detail what he means, and the connection to this ship that was being pulled out of the Persian Gulf some time ago. Do you know precisely what he's referring to?
He said, you may remember that the ship was pulled out because we thought that, I guess, their feeling was, I shouldn't guess, that there may have been some attack on that ship.
Yeah,
so they pulled that ship out.
Tremendous sensitivity in the Persian Gulf ever since the attack on the USS Cole, in which 17, do I recall correctly, John, 17 Americans.
Senator Hatch also says that part of the problem and part of the reason that we haven't known as much as we should have is that the CIA has been cut so much and their budget has been cut so much, and we have not had the human intelligence to be able to infiltrate the various organizations that we used to have prior to the 70s.
Let me just ask you one more question, but Senator Hatch appears to be talking about communication between people who either know or associated with Osama bin Laden in the wake of this incident.
Yes.
And we all know what happened in this incident, so is he talking about people talking about the operation in ways that you and I and millions of Americans would not?
Well, I guess what he's saying is we have, before they were saying, well, we think it's bin Laden, we're not sure, and he is saying, I have some data, I have some information that says people associated with him acknowledge that it's happened. So more and more the finger points more definitely at bin Laden. But I also talked to Senator John Edwards, Peter, who's a Democrat from North Carolina and is on the Intelligence Committee and is one of the, as you know, young, fresh faces that some people say might be a presidential candidate. And he didn't seem as definite. He had just talked to the head of the CIA, and we have that if you want to see that.
Yeah, here's the tape. By all means, we'd love to hear your part of your interview.
Senator Edwards, I understand that earlier today you spoke to the head of the CIA, George Tenet. Can you tell us anything about that discussion?
The thing that's clear to me is that they're making real progress, that we're going to identify who's responsible for this, and that we're, in fact, as a nation, going to hold them responsible.
We keep hearing that it's Osama bin Laden. How do we know that?
I can't answer that question. I'm sorry.
Maybe this sounds like a very dumb question, but are we sure that this was done by foreigners?
Well, I think at this moment, the public is certainly not sure. I think the director of our intelligence gathering activities feel like they've made real progress and have a pretty good idea of what's happening and who's responsible.
Could I just have a yes or no? Are we sure it's not foreigners?